Alright, hello everyone and welcome to the Telerik Webinar on ASP.NET 5. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening based on wherever you're at, and thank you so much for joining us. We have a lot to cover in this next hour. We will look at all things new and shiny in ASP.NET 5, as well as where Telerik UI suites can help you build the next generation of amazing web applications. So, just a quick round of introductions before we begin. We are your Telerik developer advocates and hopefully familiar faces by now. I am Sam Basu from Pennsylvania, and with me I have our resident web expert, Ed Charbonneau from Kentucky. The letters in green represent our respective Twitter handles. Please reach out to us at any time during or after the webinar so we can keep the conversation going. We love to chat with our fellow developers. Now, what's a Telerik webinar without some really cool prizes? And we have two awesome ones for you. An Xbox One and a GoPro camera. You guys are in the line to win one of these prizes just for showing up. So go ahead and play your hearts out in the digital Xbox world or capture your adventurous life through the GoPro camera. Developers gotta have fun, right? Also, keep in mind there is a Q&A panel at your disposal. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type it in and we'll try to answer those questions. If you have any technical issues, our support staff is on call, so they'll try to help you out. But also, we are recording this entire webinar, so look for the recording of the webinar to be posted on YouTube, as well as a follow-up blog post where we try to answer more of your questions. Alright, so it's time to finally jump in now. Now, before I get into ASP.NET though, I do want to spend just a little bit of time talking about .NET, the evolution of .NET, where things began, where we're at now, and where things are headed tomorrow. And this perspective is important to keep in mind as we get into ASP.NET 5. So, a quick look back at some history here. Your beloved .NET framework began way back in 2002, and it's come a long way starting from .NET 1.1 to .NET 4.5, which is our present production version in 2015. Along the way, the CLR, the Common Language Runtime, which does most of the grunt work, has grown quite a bit, and Microsoft has added lots of managed libraries into the .NET framework, which gives you more and more abstractions as a developer. So here's a quick look at our present big picture with the .NET framework. You'll notice that the fundamentals of the .NET framework, like the CLR, the base class libraries, all of the language support, give you an enormous amount of flexibility to build various types of applications that run on top of the .NET framework. You could build web applications or API services with the ASP.NET stack. You could build Windows desktop applications with WinForms or WPF, or even Windows Store apps with WinRT. Now, is there anything wrong with this picture? Well, not really, but there's a risk. With all the flexibility of different types of applications running on .NET, the tricky part is all these applications depend on a single giant monolithic framework, and the .NET framework has become a little bloated trying to accommodate so many different technologies. IT admins anywhere will tell you that they have a whole process to upgrade the .NET framework from one version to the next one because they do not want to break the dependencies and in turn break all their applications. So, going forward, should we continue using this giant monolithic framework or maybe break it down into smaller manageable pieces? So, going forward, there is a small fork in the road. The next iteration of the .NET framework, as you know it today, is going to be the .NET Framework 4.6. This is the same monolithic framework with all of the component pieces and technologies built in. So all of your applications, web, desktop, or mobile that you have running on .NET today will run just fine in .NET Framework 4.6. There is, however, a new kid on the block, and that's .NET Core 5. This is the .NET framework written from ground up, with a lesser API canvas, but with huge benefits like it being much more linear and modular. One of the big news in .NET Core 5 is the introduction of Core CLR, which is cross-platform. So for the first time, your .NET applications will be able to step outside of Windows and be able to run on OS X and Linux, which is pretty darn cool. And as you see from the diagram, ASP.NET 5 runs entirely on .NET Core 5, so you gain all of those benefits. .NET Core 5 also gets a fair share of help from some of the shared components, like the runtime jitters, the .NET compiler platform called Roslyn, and the NuGet package manager. NuGet actually plays a big role in this new world because it lets you get all of those modular component pieces that you need just for your applications. Now, you may have heard some rumors about the .NET framework going open source, so let's make sure you know exactly which parts are open source. It's not the whole thing, and that's for a good reason. It's only the pieces that are circled in yellow in this picture. So all of .NET Core 5 is open sourced, as is some of the common runtime components that support the .NET framework. In the ASP.NET world, ASP.NET 5 is completely open source, as is parts of ASP.NET 4, specifically the MVC bits, which have been open sourced for a while. So it is a very new, transparent, and open source world in which Microsoft is developing these technologies. So going forward, ASP.NET 5 web applications are going to run through a vertical slice of the big picture and be dependent on .NET Core, which includes the base class libraries, and Core CLR, which makes ASP.NET applications cross-platform. So now that we've looked through a little bit of the evolution of .NET, let's take a deep dive into the new ASP.NET. Take note of this URL, asp.net/vnext. This is the home for all things ASP.NET 5, and it includes the links to the GitHub repositories where you can go and find source code. This is a brand new world, and I can guarantee it's a lot of fun. So what is ASP.NET 5? Now you may have heard the term ASP.NET vNext. It really means one and the same thing, and ASP.NET 5 is the official name going forward. This is your beloved ASP.NET web development platform redesigned from ground up. It is a much more lean .NET stack meant for modern web applications, and it's made up of modular components that you get to pick and choose for your application. ASP.NET 5 is now optimized for whether you want to run your web applications on premises or in the cloud. Now, this has been in the works for a while now, and as I said, ASP.NET 5 has been developed entirely open source. If you look at the tentative timelines from Microsoft, we just had a beta 8 drop just last week. There might be an RC build in November, and we're looking at the 1.0 version of ASP.NET 5 to hit around Q1 of 2016. Now, you might be wondering, why fix something if it isn't broken? Well, ASP.NET as a web development platform has been around for quite a while now, and ASP.NET 5 is an attempt to bring it up to modern web development standards. And it's also about developer mindset. If you think about it, as an ASP.NET developer, we are used to installing Visual Studio, SQL Server, getting IIS to work, all of that before we can even write a Hello World application. Compared to that, a college kid with a Mac can just write a few lines of Node.js code and stand up a web server. So with ASP.NET 5, Microsoft is really trying to lower the barrier to entry into our walled garden and make ASP.NET 5 as a web platform accessible to any type of developer. Now, once you build your web applications with ASP.NET 5, your next question is going to be, how is it going to run? Now, with ASP.NET 5, you get a couple of choices for runtimes. First is the full .NET CLR. This is the same as running your ASP.NET applications on top of the .NET Framework 4.6. Just like today, you have the entire API set of the .NET Framework at your disposal. Alternatively, you could go with the Core CLR. This, like I said, is a subset of the .NET Framework, and it's much more of the leaner, modular, component-based architecture. You get to pull down your components through NuGet, and the big change here is you get to deploy the parts of the .NET Framework that you need for your application alongside the app itself. So different versions of the .NET Framework could be supporting different applications side by side. Alternatively, you could also go with the cross-platform CLR. This is what takes your ASP.NET applications and makes them run natively on Linux and OS X. This used to have a dependency on Mono before. Mono was the .NET port to other platforms, but Core CLR is now natively cross-platform supporting. Now, before we move on, let's talk about a couple of acronyms because you might keep hearing these over and over again. Some of these tools are command line tools, which you essentially do not need if you're already inside of a rich IDE like Visual Studio and you have NuGet, but the moment you step outside of Visual Studio or if you're doing cross-platform stuff, these are absolutely essential tools. So DNX is the .NET Executable Environment. This is the new runtime that's going to actually bootstrap your ASP.NET applications, act as a host for the Core CLR, and essentially include all of the components that your app needs at runtime. Next up is DNVM, or the .NET Version Manager. Now that you're deploying the .NET Framework as a part of your application, you will have multiple applications running different versions of the .NET Framework side by side. So DNVM allows you to manage these .NET Framework versions and get the latest DNX for your application. And then there is DNU, or the .NET Updater. This is just a package manager like NuGet, except this is meant for when you're not inside of Visual Studio. DNU allows you to manage all the dependencies, and it really pulls down all the packages that you have referenced inside of your project. And finally, there is Kestrel, which is the IIS Express equivalent, except it's meant for cross-platform usage. So it's a thin, lightweight web server that simply hosts your ASP.NET 5 applications. So all of these command line tools together give you the complete toolset that you need to build and run your ASP.NET 5 applications on any machine. Alright, so now that we have a fairly good understanding of where ASP.NET 5 is headed, let's take a quick look at some non-Microsoft technologies. Why, you may ask? Well, it helps you understand this new ecosystem in which the cross-platform ASP.NET 5 operates in. Especially if you're going to step outside of Windows and the comforts of Visual Studio, you're going to find some of these technologies indispensable. So first up is Node.js, and hopefully most of you guys are already familiar with Node.js. We simply refer to it as JavaScript on the server side. Essentially, Node.js is built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine, and it helps you build lightweight web applications with non-blocking I/O. Now, for ASP.NET 5, we don't need Node.js per se, but we need what comes with Node.js, and that's NPM. So NPM is the Node package manager, and it gives you access to the world's largest ecosystem of open source libraries. You can use some of these libraries in your ASP.NET 5 applications, but more importantly, we are going to use NPM to grab an ASP.NET 5 scaffolding tool as we begin. So next up is Homebrew, and chances are that if you're a Mac user, you've heard of Homebrew. They say Homebrew is the package manager that Apple forgot to ship with OS X. So Homebrew allows you to get third-party libraries into your machine and your applications, and we are actually going to use Homebrew to install DNX and DNVM. Next up is an interesting technology called Yeoman. Now, if you're inside of Visual Studio, you get a very nice file, new project experience that scaffolds a really nice solution structure for you with all the files and folders that you need for your ASP.NET applications. The moment you step outside of the Visual Studio, you don't have that comfort anymore. So you need a nice scaffolding tool, and that's where Yeoman comes in. There is a very polished ASP.NET 5 Yeoman generator that we're going to use. Now, if you are inside of Visual Studio, there is no reason to stop using NuGet, which still gives you access to the largest collection of .NET libraries. In fact, with Visual Studio 2015, you get to use NuGet 3, which has a whole new UI interface and a lot more flexibility to bring in and manage all of the libraries and packages that you need for your ASP.NET applications. Next up is Bower. For front-end web developers, Bower is a very popular package manager that lets you have access to an ecosystem of mostly JavaScript-based frameworks, libraries, and utilities. Microsoft is simply giving you more flexibility to use whichever package manager that you want to use to bring in the packages that you need for your applications. Next up is Grunt, and Grunt is a JavaScript task runner. You might ask, why do I need one? Well, turns out front-end web development is getting to be quite complex, and you invariably have a set of steps that you take every time you build your applications. Maybe you're expanding on your less or Sass files. Maybe you're minifying your CSS or JavaScript. Maybe you're running JS hint. And for all of these actions, you could use some automation, and that's where Grunt comes in. And in the same vein as Grunt is Gulp, which is another popular JavaScript-based task runner. Now you might ask, why not use MS Build? Well, it's a bit of an overkill for client-side applications, and plus Grunt and Gulp already have a rich ecosystem of tools built in. So Microsoft is simply trying to give you more and more flexibility to use the right tools for the job. And you could use all of these things like Bower, Grunt, and Gulp from inside of Visual Studio. Alright, so now that we've looked at some supporting technologies, let's take a look at some tooling. How are you actually going to build your ASP.NET 5 applications? Your first choice is obviously Visual Studio, and as you know, the community edition of VS 2015 is completely free, and it is still one of the best IDEs out there, which gives you a rich ecosystem of productivity tools and extensions. Now, it's one thing to say that ASP.NET applications will run outside of Windows, but is it even feasible to write a .NET application outside of Visual Studio? The answer is yes, thanks to a community effort called OmniSharp. OmniSharp recognizes that you love writing C# and .NET code, but you don't have to be inside of Visual Studio. OmniSharp simply extends the same great experience to your editor of choice. So all of these cross-platform editors like Atoms and Emacs and Sublime Text and Bracket, which are very popular among non-Microsoft developers, well now you get the same Visual Studio type IntelliSense and the richness of tools to build your ASP.NET applications in any of your code editors of choice. And finally, there is Visual Studio Code. Can you even believe Visual Studio running cross-platform on Linux or Mac? Well, now you can. With VS Code, you get a lightweight cross-platform editor that brings in most of the richness that you need. So bottom line is, you get a lot of flexibility to choose the right tools that you need to build your ASP.NET 5 applications. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. It's almost 15 minutes in and we are still in slides, which is shameful. So let's jump into some demos. I'm going to begin with my Mac desktop to show you some of the cross-platform features, and then we're going to jump into Visual Studio. Alright, so I am on my OS X desktop here, and I have installed a couple of things just so you guys are not waiting on me. So let me walk you through the steps that you need to set up your Mac to do some ASP.NET development. First thing you want to do is install Homebrew. It's just a simple Ruby command, so pull up your terminal window, paste that in, and that's going to get you Homebrew. The next thing we want to do is grab DNX using Homebrew, and we do that by saying brew tap ASP.NET/DNX. Next in line is getting dnvm installed, and we do that by saying brew install dnvm, and that should get you most of the things that you need. The next step is optional, but if you're going to use the dnvm command a lot, you might want to update your bash profile. The bash profile is a personal initialization file that's read by a terminal window, so go ahead and add this one line to your bash profile, source dnvm.sh. That makes sure that your terminal always understands what the dnvm command is. And finally, just to make sure we have the latest DNX from Microsoft, go ahead and say dnvm upgrade. So the final step is to get the beautiful OmniSharp Yeoman ASP.NET generator. This is going to give you a nice scaffolding option as you begin your ASP.NET project. So we're going to use Node Package Manager to say npm install -g for global generator-asp.net. That's it. Now you should be all set. Let me minimize this so we can proceed. So I have two windows open here. First is my Finder window, and it's just looking at a plain ASP.NET folder. And then I have my terminal window open here. So let me just type in and say dnvm. Notice right away, it knows what dnvm is. If I simply do dnvm list, that will show me all the DNX versions that are installed. Looks like I just have one, and that's the most latest one. So let me actually go into my ASP.NET folder, just so I can keep all my web projects in one place. And now I'm going to do yo ASP.NET. This brings out the Yeoman ASP.NET generator. This is just like File New Project in Visual Studio, except it's command-lined and it's cross-platform. Notice how it's giving you a choice of a few types of applications that it can create for you. Let's just go with web application, give it a name. Let's just call it Webinar, hit enter, and it does a bunch of things for you. Notice that it creates this webinar folder for you, which wasn't there before. Now this structure, the files and folders, look very much like a standard MVC project, and this is exactly what you'll get if you did this inside of Visual Studio. That's the beauty of it. Now we're going to look at some of these files and folders in just a second, but back on my terminal window, you notice that it's giving me a few hints on a couple of things that I can do, like DNU restore, build, and Kestrel. So let me actually go into the webinar folder that we just created. And now we're going to do something called DNU restore. What I'm essentially asking it to do is look at all the references of stuff that I have in my project coming from a project.json file and pull down all the bits that you need. Notice that when I do that, it fires off a whole bunch of GET calls to NuGet servers and pulls down some of the bits for me. Now, let me do the last magical step here. I'm already inside my webinar folder, so DNX knows exactly which web project I'm talking about. Now I can do DNX Kestrel. Now, Kestrel, as I mentioned, is the IIS Express equivalent, so it's a lightweight web server, but it's cross-platform. Notice how it says application started. So now let me pull up my web browser and go to localhost 5000. This 5000 port comes from a hosting.ini file, but there you have it. This is ASP.NET 5 application running natively on OS X. How mind-blowing is that? This is the same exact web application that you'll get if you did this from inside of Visual Studio. So ASP.NET 5 gives you a lot of flexibility in where your applications run. It runs on Windows, obviously, but also on Linux, OS X, or even like a Raspberry Pi. Now, it's one thing to be able to run your applications everywhere. How are you actually going to develop your applications outside of Windows? Let me show you some tooling here, and we begin with Visual Studio Code. Once VS Code comes out, I'm just simply going to do a file, open, and I'm going to point it to the root folder of the web project that we just created, and that's Webinar here. Click Open, and right away Visual Studio Code picks up all the files and folders in my project, so this is just like a Solution Explorer in Visual Studio. So let me pull up project.json here. Your old web.config stuff from the past is now gone, and all of your dependencies and your references now live in this simple file called project.json. Notice that it has a couple of commands here, Kestrel, web, and so on. So Visual Studio Code actually recognizes some of these commands. So if I do a Command Shift P, that brings up the command palette. And notice how it recognizes my DNX commands. So I could simply say DNX Kestrel from inside of Visual Studio Code, and fire up a build and go to my browser and check out my changes. So essentially you could stay in Visual Studio Code all day. So let me come out of that. Now you do get some nice code highlighting, but it's not just skin deep. So let me go into my models folder and pull up just a regular CS file. Notice how if I start typing here, I'll say using system dot. Notice that this is true Visual Studio type IntelliSense inside of Visual Studio Code. So let me back out of this and show you some more contextual IntelliSense. I'm going to go inside of my class here and start defining a variable of the type string. Notice the IntelliSense, and let's go ahead and start initializing our string. Let's just say we are trying to concatenate two strings. Notice the IntelliSense again, and we're going to say hello and then world. And notice at the very end, it does give me a prompt that you need to finish your code line. So let me hit a semicolon, and now it's good to go. Another really cool feature of VS Code is I can hold down my command key and open up another file. Notice how it opens up side by side. So I can now edit two of my code files individually at the same time. Also, keep in mind VS Code does integrate really nicely with just about any Git repository. And the debugging story for ASP.NET 5 applications is coming together quickly. So overall, VS Code is a solid code editor for you to build your next generation of ASP.NET 5 applications. And you can do this on a Mac, Linux, or Windows. And it's not hard to envision an ASP.NET project that's been worked on where one of your team members is in Visual Studio on Windows while you are on VS Code on a Mac, and you're both working on the same project. How cool is that? Now, before moving on, let me show you one more thing, and that's going back to Sublime Text, which continues to be a very popular cross-platform code editor. Same story. We're going to go to File, Open, and navigate to the webinar web project that we just created, point to the root, and hit Open. And just like that, Sublime Text now pulls up all your files and folders. Again, this is just like Solution Explorer, and you can stay in here all day long. Once you're in Sublime Text, go to your package console manager and get yourself the culture package. That's going to light up all things ASP.NET 5 inside of Sublime Text. For example, I can go and look at the same file that we were just editing, which was this guy. Notice how it remembers the code that we are writing in VS Code. And same deal here, we can go to string and do a dot. Notice how again it recognizes that I'm dealing with a string, and it gives me all the contextual IntelliSense. So overall, with VS Code, with Sublime, with Emacs and brackets and all of the OmniSharp support that you get, it is very realistic to build your ASP.NET 5 applications on any platform. Now, at the same time, Visual Studio on Windows continues to be one of the best IDEs for ASP.NET development. So let's switch gears and look at the Windows side of things. So I am on my Windows 10 desktop here and inside of Visual Studio 2015. So let me go ahead and hit File New Project here. We'll look at the web templates. Notice how there is a single unified template for ASP.NET Web applications. There is a new Telerik ASP NET MVC application as well, but we're going to stick with the boilerplate one. Let us call this Webinar, and we're going to hit OK. The next dialog that you get in this process is this new template wizard. Now notice the difference here. You get some ASP.NET 4.5.2 templates. This is all of the stuff that runs on .NET Framework 4.5 or 4.6. This new stuff here, ASP.NET 5, runs mainly on .NET Core 5. So we're going to go with the new stuff, pick the web application, and hit OK. So Visual Studio has spun up our project now, and you'll notice that it's getting some references. It's pulling down some of the bits before your project is ready to go. And finally, you have all of your references pulled in and your project is ready to fire up an ASP.NET application. Now, Ed will go over a little bit more about all of these files and folders, but essentially this solution structure looks very similar to what we saw with the Yeoman scaffolding, and that's a major advantage. There is a new www.root folder, which is where all of your static content lives. There is Bower and Grunt and Gulp integration right here inside of Visual Studio if you want. So at this point, let me go ahead and fire up our ASP.NET 5 application just to see what we get out of the box. So the new Edge browser in Windows 10 comes up, and it should load up our website running on localhost on IIS Express. And here we have it. The beauty of it lies in the fact that this is the same exact web application that we saw from my Mac, except now it's running on localhost on my Windows. Now, let me show you something that's very, very cool. I'm going to go into this About link. Notice how this is just a static page with some text on it. So let me go back to Visual Studio here, and we're going to look into our controllers folder and the home controller. So this is the page that's rendering our about link. Right here is the iAction result. And it looks like there's a little view data message here, and this is what shows up on our web page. Now, watch very closely what I do here. Keep in mind, this is just a CS file on our server side. Let's just type in live webinar. And now I'm just going to save my file. That's all. There is no need to build. Let me go back to my browser, and I'm simply going to refresh my page. Voila! So no longer do you have to continuously keep building and deploying applications. Simply make your code changes and your browser picks it up. This is a direct benefit of the Roslyn compiler platform, which is baked in inside of Visual Studio 2015 and for ASP.NET 5 applications. No longer do you have 1,000 files in your bin directory. This is all in memory, and Roslyn is continuously pumping out your web application on the go. Roslyn is pretty awesome, and it should save you tons of time in your develop and debug workflow, right? Okay, so let me go back to Visual Studio and show you one more thing. On my project, I could right-click and say Manage NuGet Packages. This is brand new as well. This is NuGet 3.0, and it's just a whole new UI and interface to better manage and discover NuGet packages, as well as the ongoing version management of all of your dependencies. Now let's say you are looking for some polished and performant UI controls for your web application, and you want to get the Telerik UI for MVC bits. Now, no longer do you have to go to Telerik.com or the Telerik control panel to download those. You can do that from inside of Visual Studio itself, because now you can set up a new private NuGet feed and simply point to it. So let me go ahead and change the package source to point to the Telerik NuGet gallery. Now, this is a private NuGet feed, so the first time you launch it, it will ask for your authentication, so you can get in with your Telerik account. Now, notice here is the Telerik UI for ASP NET MVC5. This now is supporting of MVC6 and will be the default MVC suite going forward for your modern ASP.NET 5 applications. So that is pretty much all that I wanted to show with the demos, and hopefully you see the flexibility. Whether you're on Windows, OS X, or Linux, you get an almost identical getting started experience and the same exact ASP.NET 5 web application that you can build and run on just about any platform. This is pretty cool, right? Okay, so let me get back to my slides now. So after looking through all of the demos, do you now feel that ASP.NET 5 is moving your cheese? Well, that's a yes and no. On one side, they had to modernize ASP.NET as a web platform, make it more open source friendly, allow you the flexibility to use whichever IDE you want and just the right tools that you need to build your next web application. But at the same time, you can still do the things that you're doing today. You can stay inside the comforts of Visual Studio and have the familiar paradigms of WebForms and MVC to keep you company. So let us do a quick overview of some of the broad things that are changing, and we begin with MVC. ASP.NET 5 includes the next generation of MVC, and that's MVC6. Ed will talk more about MVC in just a bit, but let me cover some of the broad points. MVC6 sees the merger of two familiar technologies, MVC and Web API. With just simple data annotations, you can now decide whether your controller returns HTML markup as an MVC controller or data as a Web API. You get to use something called view components, which are reusable pieces of server-side markup. The old HTML helpers of MVC yesterday are gone, and they're now replaced with a much more polished tag helpers. MVC6 also gets a routing overhaul, so it has more robust fallback plans to find the resources that you're trying to serve up for your web application. So while we're talking MVC, let me mention Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC. You may have heard of Kende UI, which is our client-side HTML5 JavaScript framework. Now, if you did not want to write so much of client-side code, UI for ASP.NET MVC is the perfect set of tools because it allows you to render all of those 70 plus polished and performant Kende UI widgets from the server-side comforts. Now, here are some benefits that you get with Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC. Your web applications simply work on any device, period. So you get built-in mobile support and responsiveness. You get easy CRUD operations against your data sources. You get built-in yet customizable themes for all of your controls. Start today at telerik.com/ASP.NET-MVC. Now, we are pretty excited about ASP.NET 5 and all of the upcoming changes, and I think you'll agree that our latest Q3 release reflects some of that excitement. There is a brand new spreadsheet control which brings all the power of Excel to your web applications. There is a new Nova theme which is modern and very mobile friendly. There is now support for Telerik document processing libraries, which means all of your Office document processing can now be brought to your web applications. we now have built-in support for VS 2015 and the latest in ASP.NET 5, which means Beta 7 and MVC 6. There's a private NuGet server feed, which I showed you, that lets you easily get the MVC bits into your web application. But my favorite feature are the new scaffolding tools for MVC chart, grid, and scheduler. Given a model and a data context, these scaffolding tools allow you to easily chain together your model, your view, and your controller, as well as configure the properties of some of the complex UI that you're about to render. They are pretty sweet. Now, let us switch gears and talk a little bit about WebForms, because that is the reality for lots and lots of enterprise web applications. Now, with .NET Core 5, the traditional WebForms dependency on system.web.dll is no more. So you may be wondering, is WebForms dying? Well, actually, not at all. And you can comfortably use WebForms for years and years to come. And that's because of .NET Framework 4.6, which brings in lots and lots of enhancements to the next version of WebForms, and that's 4.6 as well. To start off, there is now support for the new HTTP 2 standard. Now, one of the drawbacks of HTTP was the limited number of concurrent connections between your server and your web application running on your browser. HTTP 2 streamlines that and helps you serve up a lot more content seamlessly from your WebForms applications. There is also now support for asynchronous model binding. If you're using an ORM like Entity Framework, you can now easily bind your UI components to models on the server side. And you could use asynchronous task-based async and await methods on the server side, which increases your website's performance and helps in scalability. Now, all of the benefits of the Roslyn compiler platform that we saw for MVC makes its way into WebForms 4.6. No longer do you have to keep building and deploying your web applications. You now get on-the-fly compilation from Roslyn. Also, keep in mind all of your legacy WebForms application will run just fine in WebForms 4.6 on top of .NET Framework 4.6. Now, while we're talking WebForms, let me mention Telerik UI for ASP.NET Ajax. This is one of our richest control suites with 80 plus polished UI controls meant for your WebForms applications. You get benefits like seamless UX across all devices, mobile support and responsiveness, and built-in professional skins. You can start today at the URL listed here. Now, let's take a quick look at what's new in Telerik UI for ASP NET Ajax as of the last Q3 release. You get a brand new spreadsheet control, just like the MVC bits. Most of the UI controls now have modern, lightweight, and responsive rendering. Some of the major hard-hitting enterprise controls like grids and Gantt charts get lots and lots of features. And you also get a new customizable theme builder, so you can start with a professional grade skin and make it your own. So bottom line is, if you are building ASP.NET WebForms applications today, maybe it's time to stop reinventing the wheel. Take a good look at Telerik UI for ASP NET Ajax. You'll be amazed with what we have built over the years. And finally, let me talk about Telerik DevCraft. Both of the collections that I talked about, Telerik UI for ASP NET Ajax and UI for ASP NET MVC, are part of the bigger DevCraft collection. This is one of the richest .NET toolboxes that you can find for any developers, and it helps you build next generation of amazing .NET applications for any platform, web, desktop, or mobile. Alright, so I have been speaking for a while now, but hopefully all of this gives you a nice overview with all things new and shiny with ASP.NET 5. This is a really good time to be an ASP.NET developer, and hopefully you are as excited about ASP.NET 5 as I am. So that's it from me, and I'll talk to you again during Q&A. Ed, my friend, you have the floor.
Thanks for the floor, Sam. ASP.NET MVC 6 is a ground-up rewrite of the popular .NET web platform. Today we'll be covering some of the biggest changes in MVC 6. We'll start by looking over File New MVC project. Next, we'll talk about tag helpers. And we'll finish up with our MVC discussion by seeing how configuration has changed in MVC 6. So let's jump into Visual Studio 2015 and hit File New Project. And I'm going to choose ASP.NET Web Application and hit OK. And right away you'll notice there's two different types of templates. There's ASP.NET 4.6 and ASP.NET 5 preview template. Now, ASP.NET 5 is currently in beta, so some of these things may change slightly after the final release. Now, notice when I click on an ASP.NET 4 MVC template, I have the option to include WebForms and Web API in that project. Well, with ASP.NET 5, there is no checkbox available below because WebForms is unavailable, and in this version, MVC and Web API are both the same framework. So choosing a ASP.NET 5 application by default is both MVC and Web API. I'm going to click OK and let the new project get created. And before we get too far into discussing what's new, let's talk about what's missing from previous versions of MVC. First, you'll notice that the App Start folder is missing. This folder previously contained various startup processes and settings such as configuration, identity, and routing. Also, the global ASAX file is no longer needed. Instead, all of the startup functionality that was once contained in App Start and global ASAX has been placed under startup.cs. Next, the app data folder that once held application local databases and log files isn't included in this release. You can add back the app data folder if it's needed in your application. And it may come as a surprise that the root web config file is also gone from this version of MVC. Now all application settings can be found in config.json. And finally, the scripts and content folders in this version of MVC have been given a new home under the www.root directory. This directory is used for any static content such as JavaScript, CSS, or image files for your website. Next, let's take a look at part of the project template that hasn't changed a lot. The core components of the MVC pattern, model, view, and controller, have mostly remained the same. However, the views folder has a new item called the view imports file. This view imports file is used to declare global namespaces that can be used in any view in the project. It's also worth mentioning that Bootstrap 3.0 continues to be used in this version of MVC for all the views in the project. Now, let's take a look at what's new. There's a lot here to cover, but knowing where to find each piece and its purpose will give you a head start on your next project. Let's start from the absolute root folder of the project. This is the source folder. The source folder is used to identify the source code of the project. It was added in this version of .NET to match conventions commonly found with other open source projects and many popular ones on GitHub. The next item is the www.root folder. This folder is used to host and serve static resources. Here you'll find JavaScript, CSS, and image files, and there's also a lib folder that contains third-party JavaScript libraries that were added by the Bower Package Manager. Here you can see Bootstrap, jQuery, and other JavaScript files. Next, we have our dependencies node. More package management options are available in MVC6. Bower and NPM support have been added in this version. Configuration for both Bower and NPM can be managed by a GUI here. And you can also manage Bower and NPM dependencies in their respective JSON files found in the root source folder. The next new folder in the project is migrations. MVC6 ships with Entity Framework 7, which no longer supports EDMX database modeling. Because EF7 is focused on code first, the migrations folder is where you'll find database creation, initialization, and migration code. Here you can see where code migrations are used to create a new database. Moving on, the next new item is services. Services are at the forefront of MVC6. Since MVC6 was built with dependency injection at its core, services can be easily instantiated by the framework and used throughout the application. Let's move on to the files that are found in the root of the application. Here we have the Bower and package.json files. These popular package management systems were born from the web and open source development communities. Bower hosts popular packages like Bootstrap, while NPM brings dependencies like gulp. The bower.json and package.json files are used to register and install Bower and NPM packages with full IntelliSense support. If we look in the bower.json file, you can see that the dependencies have already been registered when the template was created. To see the IntelliSense in action, I'll delete the Bootstrap package and re-add it and update the version. Saving the bower.json file will automatically update the packages in your application. Much like Bower and NPM, Gulp is another tool built for the web by the web. It's been given first-class support in MVC6. Gulp is a Node.js-based task runner that has many plugins available from NPM. There are packages for compiling, minifying, and bundling CSS. There are also packages for .NET developers for invoking MS Build, NuGet, NUnit, and more. These tasks are configured using JavaScript and can be found in gulpfile.js. Next, we have config.json. Gone are the days of XML configuration in ASP.NET MVC. Now, all settings such as connection string and application title are held in JSON format. The entire configuration process for MVC6 has been rewritten from the ground up. We'll cover this in detail in another video. Since ASP.NET 5 was designed with a pluggable service layer, it has removed the hard dependency on IIS. The hosting.ini file is mainly used for configuring the web listener for hosting without IIS or IIS Express. One of the biggest changes in ASP.NET 5 MVC6 is the project.json file. The file is used to describe the application and its dependencies and replaces the csproj file. Unlike prior versions of MVC, .NET dependencies for your application can be added and removed using the project.json file. These dependencies are resolved through NuGet, and full IntelliSense is enabled within the file. This means that you can begin typing the desired NuGet package name, and suggestions will appear on the fly. Cross-platform compilation and build scripts are also configured here. And the last file we'll look at is startup.cs. In previous versions, MVC application startup was handled in AppStart and global.asax. With ASP.NET 5, startup is handled in startup.cs. The startup method is the first method in the application to run, and it's only run once. During startup, the application's configuration is read, dependencies are resolved and injected, and routes are created. To wrap up, the MVC6 project template embraces the web in many ways. From the root folder and below, most of the project structure has changed to align with the ever-changing web. The inclusion of Bower and NPM, in addition to NuGet, provide developers with a wide range of options for bringing modular components to their applications. The standardization on the JSON format for configuration further aligns with web methodologies. While many things have changed in the project template, the core of MVC has remained the same. Next, we'll be covering tag helpers. Tag helpers are a new feature in MVC6 for creating reusable HTML components. Let's discuss the reasoning behind why tag helpers were added to MVC6, then learn how to identify a tag helper in a view, and get an idea of what environment, script, and link helpers can do. Let's begin by discussing the reason that tag helpers were created. By understanding why tag helpers were created, we can get a better idea of what a tag helper is, and not only identify them, but write our own. Tag helper syntax looks a lot like HTML by using elements and attributes, but it's processed by Razor on the server. Tag helpers are an alternative syntax to HTML helper methods, and improve the developer experience by providing a rich and seamless API that couldn't be achieved by Razor alone. These reasons will be much more apparent in a demo, so let's jump into Visual Studio and compare HTML helpers to the new tag helpers. Here I have Visual Studio 2015 open to an MVC6 project. I have a view open so we can test out some HTML helpers and see where they start to fall apart with the developer experience and why tag helpers were implemented in MVC6 to solve some of these problems. So I'm going to start by actually writing out the HTML that I'd like this HTML helper to output. So you can see here I have a link that has an href to index and a class of button primary. So when I run this in the browser, you can see I have a button that says go home, and I'm using Bootstrap to theme the button. So let's jump back into Visual Studio and write an HTML helper that would do the same thing. So if I wanted to write this same HTML using an HTML helper, I would use something like html.actionLink with the text of go home, and then point to the index action. But then here's where things start to break down a little bit. I have to satisfy all of the method parameters before I can even define a class. And then once I do, I have to use some tricks to kind of get that class in there by declaring an anonymous object and then escaping class because that is a reserved word, and so on. So an alternative way of doing this would be to just write out the HTML directly and then use some Razor to define the href by using url.action and giving that the index action and the home controller. But now I have Razor syntax inside of my HTML tag, so that's not exactly perfect either. So let's look at tag helpers and look at how tag helpers can help clear this up. So I'm going to replace this last example with a tag helper so we can compare the difference between the HTML helper and the new tag helper. So I'm going to remove this last line, and I'm going to start typing this exactly as I would if I wanted HTML. I'm going to start with an anchor tag, and now notice the IntelliSense I have ASP action. This is going to allow me to define the URL where I'd like this link to go to. So I'm going to declare the index action, and now I am free to go ahead and continue with the CSS class that I'd like to use. And notice I have IntelliSense for Bootstrap as I type this out. To button primary, and now I can close the tag and write go home. And now if you compare the HTML helper and the tag helper looks a whole lot more like the actual output that I'd like to receive when I write this code. And one very important observation to make here is that the tag helper is highlighted in a bold purple color, so it can be distinguished from just plain HTML that's in the markup. So this is a simple demonstration of how tag helpers look in MVC6, but there are some more advanced tag helpers that come with the new framework. Let's take a look in the MVC project and see what some of those tag helpers are like. Now I'm going to open the layout for this project. And again, notice the purple tags that are being bolded and highlighted here. I've got two special types of tag helpers in this layout, and one of those is environment and the other one is link. So these new tag helpers allow us to do some interesting things that we couldn't do before. Notice the environment tag helpers. We have one that says the name or names is development. So the tags that are rendered within this markup here only show up during development. And the environment tags below are for staging and production. So these would only show up if we were in staging or production environments. And these link tags are also special here. And if you look, they go to a CDN. And we have what's called an ASP fallback and a test attribute. Now, this is going to actually test certain cases for these situations. So it's going to look for a specific class, property, or in case of, say, JavaScript, it would look for a certain method that's available to make sure that those CDNs loaded properly. And if they haven't, it will fall back to one that is on disk locally. If you're coming to ASP.NET MVC6 from using previous versions, you'll quickly realize that things have changed. One of the major changes in this version of MVC is the lack of a web config file. XML configuration is a thing of the past. In MVC6, the web config was completely removed and the configuration experience was overhauled. The new configuration consists of a variety of options including JSON-based files and environment variables. Let's get an understanding of where configuration has moved, what the new features are, and how to get values from configuration to the application. To get a complete picture of how configuration works in MVC6, let's take a look at the configuration lifecycle. First, configuration sources are identified in the startup function of startup.cs. Configuration values are stored in JSON files and environment variables, and you also have the ability to use multiple types of configuration files that you can specify yourself. Next, configuration values are read and applied from the configuration services also found in startup.cs. And then finally, the values are retrieved from memory using dependency injection. Let's jump into Visual Studio and take a look at where these things operate. I have Visual Studio 2015 open to an ASP.NET MVC6 project, and the first thing I'm going to do is open the startup.cs file. The first thing we need to do is look at the configuration builder. This is found in the startup method of the startup.cs file. The configuration builder's purpose is to collect all of the configuration sources and compile those into a resource that we can use later. Notice the configuration builder that was created for us when we did File New Project. You can see that we have a config.json file that's been added to the configuration builder, and a second config environment.json file that we can use optionally. This can be used to specify specific configurations based on our environment, such as production and deployment. Additional settings like user secrets and environment variables are added further down the pipeline before the configuration is built. Let's go ahead and add our own configuration options. We'll do this by opening up the config.json that was specified in the configuration builder. At the root level, I'm going to add an object called myOptions and a key of config message with a value of hello from config.json. Now that we've added our values to the configuration file, we need to be able to retrieve them in our application. To do this, I've added a class to this project called myOptions, and it has a property called config message. We'll need this to map the values from the configuration back into our application. Let's go back over to startup.cs and load the values from configuration into the new class we created. To do this, we'll need to go down to the configuration services section. In the configuration services section, you can see where other services are receiving their configurations as well. For example, you can see Facebook authentication and other authentication services retrieving their values from configuration here. Let's go ahead and retrieve our configuration values by tapping into the services pipeline. Here I'm using services.configure myOptions and retrieving the value by using configuration getSection myOptions. This will use a convention-based approach to find the values that we added to the config.json file. Next, let's go over to a controller and retrieve the values. I'm going to go to the home controller, and we're going to need to add a new constructor to the home controller. The values are made available to the applications controller by adding the options to any controller's constructor. Since we're using the dependency injection that has already been made available in MVC6, we'll just need to reference the value. Using iOptions of t as an argument in the constructor will resolve the dependency. This works because the service provider is resolved for us in the creation of the controller instance. The config message can now be retrieved from the options, and we can assign that to a field which can later be used in an action on our controller. In the index action, the config message has been assigned to some view data so we can retrieve it in the view and display it on the page. When we run the application, you can see hello from config.json was retrieved from our config.json file and displayed on the web page. In previous versions of MVC, managing application settings for different environments, such as development and production, meant using transformations. In MVC 6, this system has gone away in favor of configuration overloading. In this example, imagine we have two configuration files with the same key and different values. Depending on the order those configuration files were added to the configuration builder, the last item in should win. This would result in the value bar being retrieved from configuration. This is valuable because it allows us to specify different configuration files that can be loaded in different parts of the application development cycle. These can be used to control values when the application is in production and in development environments. Let's jump back into Visual Studio and see how these configuration overloads can be used to our advantage. Back to startup.cs in the startup method. You can see that there's two JSON files that are being specified in the configuration builder, config.json and config environment name.json. Config environment name.json will look for a file with a matching environment name. The file will be loaded, but it's optional, so the application won't throw an error if the file is not found. Let's add a configuration file that's specific to our development environment. We could do this by going to our solution and adding a new JSON file. We'll use File, Add, New Item, and then choose JSON file, and we'll name this one config.development.json. Next, I'll paste in the new values that we want to use in our development environment. In the development environment, we'll set the configuration message to hello from config.development.json. When the application is reloaded, you can see that the config message has changed. Now our view is picking up the hello from config.development.json. This is because the new value has overloaded the one found in the config.json file. Let's repeat the process, but this time we'll use a configuration file for production instead. This time we'll use the value of hello from config.production.json. When the application is reloaded, notice it still says hello from config.development.json. This is because the environment variable is set to development. If it were deployed to a production server, the message would be hello from config.production.json. To demonstrate how the production configuration would be loaded in a production environment, let's change the environment variable to production and reload the application. Now that the environment is set to production, the configuration value hello from config.production.json is displayed. So now we've seen some of the big changes in MVC 6. We started with File New Project and saw how the new MVC 6 template works. We explored tag helpers and how to recognize them in views and use them in our applications. And we saw how to take control of configuration and get values from config.json into our application. So as you can see, there's a lot of new things going on in the .NET space today, from web to mobile to desktop. But we're not done here yet, so stick around. Sam and I will be answering questions in just a moment. While we catch our breath, take a moment to bookmark these resources. You can use them to keep up to date with all your favorite .NET and Telerik tools. Thanks for your time, and we'll be ready in just a moment.